And welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. We have a great event for you this evening featuring Senator Mazie Hirono and her new memoir, Heart of Fire. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. This event was pre-recorded, so you won't be able to post a question during it, but we did collect some questions from viewers ahead of time, and they'll be asked during the discussion. The chat function will be active, and in that box, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Heart of Fire. Many of you, if not all of you, become familiar with seeing Senator Hirono her mind in congressional hearings or TV interviews, whether about the Brett Kavanaugh nomination to the Supreme Court, the impeachment trials of Donald Trump, or some other issue. She's become one of the most frank and fiery advocates on Capitol Hill. Well, she hasn't always been that way. She used to be a bit more restrained. And in Heart of Fire, she recounts her life's epic journey, the struggles she faced, and the shedding in recent years of a reserved demeanor for a more outspokenly fierce one. The book takes readers back to when, as a child, she left Japan and crossed the Pacific on a ship in steerage with her mother and one brother, arriving in Hawaii and growing up poor there. She made it through not only college, but law school, developing skills that would help make her an effective advocate. Her own experiences with economic insecurity, lack of healthcare access, and family separation have influenced her views over the years as she's risen in politics, beginning in 1980 with her election to the Hawaii House of Representatives. In 1994, she was elected Hawaii's lieutenant governor. In 2006, she made it to the U.S. House of Representatives, and 6 years after that was elected to the U.S. Senate, becoming Hawaii's first female senator and the first Asian American woman to serve in the U.S. Senate. Hers is an inspiring story, an immigrant daughter's story, as she calls it in the book's subtitle, and she tells it quite movingly. Library Journal called Heart of Fire an honest look at how much grit it takes for people from less privileged backgrounds to make it in American politics. The Senator will be in conversation this evening with Nina Totenberg, NPR's legal affairs correspondent. Nina has been with NPR since the mid-1970s and over the years has won many broadcast journalism awards, not only for her scoops, but also for her exceptional analysis. Politics and Prose Live welcomes Senator Mazie Hirono and Nina Totenberg.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Let me say just a few words about how I first got to know Senator Hirono. I, as you all know, cover the Supreme Court and the judiciary in general and all things legal as much as one human being can. And I was sitting in a Judiciary Committee hearing room when, for the third or fourth time, Senator Hirono asked a nominee for a judicial appointment or an executive appointment, I don't remember which, whether they'd ever been involved in a sexual harassment complaint or the target of a sexual harassment complaint. And eventually she said that she was going to ask that of every nominee, male or female, for every position that came before her. And that was in 2018, I think. And it prompted me to want to do a profile of her. I didn't know her before then. And I came to, I look back at the piece that I wrote as a result of that, both broadcast and digital. And the headline, which I remember writing, is "The Quiet Rage of Mazie Hirono," which is borne out by this book. It's not a bitter book. It's a very heartfelt book, and it's called, of course, Heart of Fire. And the Heart of Fire, I think that she's talking about actually is her mother's, but she might have as well have called it Hearts of Fire. So I'm very pleased and was very pleased when she called up and said, would I interview her for this event at Politics and Prose. So welcome, everybody. Nice to see you, even from a distance, Mazie.
Aloha, Nina. It's great to see you once again.
It's great to see you. The senator once tried to teach me how to make one of those paper, what do you call it?
Cranes,
Paper
origami
crane.
cranes.
Yeah, origami cranes. It was an almost hopeless proposition. She's not only a senator, and she is a really artistic human being. This is a beautifully written book about Hawaii and her upbringing there. But as Bradley said, it starts really with your mother's background and her why she came to Hawaii, escaping really your father.
Mhm.
So
Yes.
tell us about that.
My mother married my father when she was only 21, I think, and he hid the fact that he was a compulsive gambler and an alcoholic, two terrible more than habits. And when that all emerged, she just, after 3 children, really a terrible existence, living with her in-laws who treated her like a slave and a chattel, she determined that the only thing she could do to create a better life for herself and her children was to escape him. But she had to do it. She had to plot to get away from him, because if he had found out, he would have stopped us. So tremendous courage to bring us to a new country that she knew, but her children had absolutely no idea. Hawaii, America, what?
So how old were you and your brother then?
I was almost 8. My brother was 9. And she brought the 2 older kids and left my younger brother, Wayne. His name was Shigeki. He was only 3 years old. He would have been too young to go to school. There would be nobody in Hawaii to take care of them. So she brought her older children who could start school.
So describe the first number of years and how she supported you and how you lived.
She worked a couple of jobs. We lived in a rooming house, a rooming house with 1 bed where we basically slept sideways. And we shared a kitchen area. It wasn't even a kitchen, at the end of a hallway with all these rooms off the side of the hallway. So we didn't have healthcare. Growing up, my greatest fear was Mom would get sick and she wouldn't be able to go to work, and there would be no money if she didn't go to work. And so the idea of healthcare as so fundamental and as a right, not a privilege, certainly was something I experienced growing up. But we were poor, and we didn't know anything about a social safety net, by the way. We had no idea. My mother just knew that she had to work hard in low-paying jobs with no benefits to take care of us.
So what were her first jobs?
She
worked
worked-
2 jobs. She worked 2 jobs, right?
She worked as a typesetter at the Hawaii Hochi, which is a Japanese language paper. She had never done that kind of work before, but she taught us. She taught herself, I should say. And then she also worked for a catering company, and she would, do that kind of work. She had a uniform, and they would serve people at different parties. So that was her evening job. She wasn't home that early, that many nights a week. And my older brother and I were latchkey children, truly, before that term was coined, I think.
Yeah. But she had just 1 uniform, right?
Yeah, yes.
So after she got home every night,
She would have to make sure it was clean. She would work, I think she worked at least 3 nights a week doing that. And so she had to make sure her white uniform. She had another one that was sort of like a muumuu, but that was only on special occasions that she would wear that at catering. But basically, yes. And
So
we would
what
have to
time-
wash
what
it by
time did-
hand.
what time did she leave in the morning?
She would leave really early in the morning because she had to catch the bus, and the Hawaii Hochi was way off past downtown. So she got up really early and she would come home late. And that's one of my recollections of waiting with my older brother, Roy, at the bus stop, waiting for her to get off the bus.
But she, there was no doubt that she loved you passionately, I think one would say, and did everything to take care of you.
Yes, she was very devoted to us. And how much more devotion could be shown than that she brought us to a whole new country to create a better life for ourselves, to give us a chance. because I was raised on my grandparents' farm from the time I was 3 till just before I came to this country. So I did not know my father at all. And so to bring us from that environment, which was a very, I had a peaceful childhood with my grandmother, who I loved very much, but she wanted us all to be together, and to such devotion, such courage. And that's the heart of fire, Nina.
That is the heart of fire. But she imparted that to you. You know, there's a scene fairly early in your book. You are going to a grammar school that, oddly enough, even though you lived in very poor circumstances, was populated principally by quite middle-class Japanese,
Yes.
Hawaiian, American children, who, as
Yes.
you put it, wore closed shoes.
Yeah.
So, and there was a kid named Robert. So
Yeah.
talk about that a little bit.
He was a blonde, skinny kid. I remember him. I can still see his face. He had blonde hair. He had a chipped tooth, and he always wore a clean white shirt. But basically, that was the one shirt that I remember him wearing. And often he wouldn't have lunch. In those days, it was a quarter for lunch. And he would often not have lunch. And the reason we would know is that we would have to bring our lunch from the cafeteria to the classroom, and he wouldn't have lunch. But I do remember a teacher asking him, "Why aren't you having lunch?" When I knew full well why he wasn't having lunch. We didn't have a free lunch program back in those days.
And so apparently you didn't chat with each other, but there came a time when the teacher went through the class saying there was going to be some sort of a party and making assignments.
That was one of the most mortifying things. After all these years, I still remember how I felt. And we were going to have a class party, and she just went around saying, "Can you bring this? Can you bring that?" And she told me to bring bread. Well, I knew what bread was, but she didn't say sandwich. So I took it very literally. I went home and I said to Mom, my mother, "I have to bring bread." And she said, "What?" I mean, could she mean a sandwich? I said, "I don't know." She said bread. So my mother compromised and cut the bread into 4 like little finger sandwiches. When I took my little package to school, and they were all piled up, and the teachers opening up everybody's food, and she came to mine, and by this time I knew that I had gotten it all wrong. I still remember how mortified I felt. And then she opened mine up and she said, "Who brought this?" And a little voice piped up, "Oh, I like plain bread." I think that was Robert.
So you connected those moments to the school lunch program that you tried to expand, right?
Well, I figured out for myself, and I think maybe the teachers, because one thing was I was a good student, and they kind of played some favorites at that school, so I have to say. And although I obviously was a poor kid, but I caught on. I mean, remember, I didn't speak any English at all when I came to this country, and there was no such thing as English language classes. You just have to learn how to speak. And I was totally discouraged from speaking Japanese at all, which is yet another reason that I believe one's language is an important part of cultural identity. But I have to get myself acculturated. And so it was clear I didn't have much money. And the school decided that I should be a school lunch cashier so that they could give me a free lunch every day. So I made my own little school lunch program.
But later on, you worked very hard to expand the school lunch program.
Well, certainly I still do that, by the way, because nutrition is so foundational. And so both in the state legislature and clearly in the Congress, that when we start talking about support for our schools and enabling our agricultural products to be in our schools, those are all things that I continue to work on.
You know, I look back at this article that I wrote a couple of years ago, and I said that you were actually no stranger to badassery, even way back in the beginnings of your larger ambitions, when you decided you were going to run for lieutenant governor, and you had lunch with then governor, I guess it was Caetano. I'm
He
not-
was lieutenant governor at the time. He was running for governor.
Mhm.
Yes. And he
Go ahead.
knew that the wide race and very few people even had heard of me. And he was going to have a hard time himself. And so he decided I wasn't the partner that he needed to get himself elected. And in Hawaii, the lieutenant governor has to run his or her own race. And so he came, I knew that he wanted to talk me out of running. So we had coffee and he went into this whole long thing about why I shouldn't run. And at the end of which I just said, you know, Ben, this is just such bullshit. I am running, and by the time the primary election comes, people will know who I am. And I got 10,000 more votes in my primary than he got in his. So there.
And I should say, they made me bleep out part of the bullshit anyway.
Oh, really? You did?
Yes, yes, they did when
know
I
that.
did the piece. NPR is very proper that way.
I'm kind of surprised, Nina.
So there, there are many traits you learned from your mother about how to just sort of move forward.
Mhm.
And one of them that really struck me was when you were actually editor-in-chief of your school paper in high school.
Yes. And so I have been in news writing. I am for 3 years. I worked myself up to become the editor-in-chief of the school paper, which was it was an award-winning paper. So, there was a lot of work involved. We put it out every 2 weeks. And so in the start of the year, when I was going to become editor-in-chief, the advisor announces that there's going to be some guy who's going to come into news writing, never been a part of news writing before. And he was going to be my co-editor-in-chief. And I said, what? And she said, well, there's this person named Allison Lind, and he is going to come in. He's going to be your co-editor. And back then, you don't talk back to your teachers. Let's face it. I certainly didn't, except a little bit later on. And so I accepted it. And then I ended up, as is the case for so many women, I ended up doing most of the work because he was deemed the better writer, and he was going to make sure that we had put out the kind of paper that was going to continue to be award winning. But he would never stay late to do the pay stubs and all that, because we used to put out a very professional school paper, which went to a regular printer and all of that to be printed up. So there would be pay stub and everything that I had to do. And I would be there every day, late at night. And finally, one night I couldn't take it anymore. I called him. And I said, why aren't you here? He said, I'm doing my homework. And I just said, homework on my eyeballs. I didn't swear back then, as I do now. And I said, you get over here. And so he did. But that's the kind of thing that a lot of women have to experience. That, Barack Obama's grandmother was the first vice president of the largest bank in Hawaii. And she would train all these college educated men, and they would get promoted ahead of her because she didn't have a college degree. She did the work. So this is kind of typical for a lot of women. That's why we have to stand up for ourselves.
You knew her because,
Yeah.
And Barack Obama didn't know until his
No.
inauguration, but you tell the story.
Well, I didn't know that I was doing part-time work for his grandmother. Her name was Madeline Dunham. And I didn't even know that he was her much loved grandmother who helped to raise him, just as my grandmother raised me, until he was running for president. And I began to think, wait a minute, was that the woman that I did part-time work for? Every time the bank needed, or her part of the bank needed more workers, she would call on me because I was signed up at a temp agency during that time. And so
She knew you were a hard worker. She knew you were a hard worker. But the other thing that was interesting about your newspaper experience, other than that you didn't become a reporter, is that your teacher, the advisor for the paper,
Yes.
sort of every day, sort of mildly, I don't know if the word is harassed, but I think
I
it's
would use
more,
that word.
So, and you use something your mother taught you
Yes.
about that too.
So I was in the news writing room every single day because it took that much work. But in the morning I would go and I would do my homework, and I'd be minding my own business, doing my homework. And the advisor would come, the same advisor who said, this guy is going to be your editor-in-chief. And she would stand over me as I was working. I was doing my homework at a desk. And she'd ask, did you do this? Did you do that? Did page one ready? Are you pasted up? She would just ask me all these things. And she never once ever bothered Allison at that time. And it really pissed me off. I didn't use that word then either. But I went home and I said, Mom, every single day she bothers me like this. What should I do? I was so shocked when my mother said, what you should do is just ignore her. Just ignore her. And I'm thinking, I'm a student. We don't do that to teachers. But I just decided to try it because my mother is a very wise person. And so the very next morning I'm there and the teacher is standing over me and all that. And I just refused to even look up. I didn't talk to her. I just kept working until finally she said, talking to you is like pulling teeth. And she walked off in a huff, but she never bugged me after that. I mean, the fact of the matter is she didn't have to bug me. I always got the paper out.
Passive aggression works sometimes.
Oh, there's a lot of that. Women, I tell you, sometimes we have to go through that, and that is a form of aggression. But that was pretty overt to not pay attention to my teacher.
You, as I'm going through this book, you always had a man in your life. For a long time, it was Allison.
Yes.
Then for a while, it was your current husband, but I'll get to that later. And then it was other people, because that relationship ended. But you did have a light bulb moment, right?
Yes, that was in college. And although I had a very fierce mother who took control over her life, although she didn't have to be vocal about it or anything, but I had such a different background from everybody else that I thought. But you can't escape the sort of the dominant culture's expectations incorporated into yourself. And so while I was in college, freshman year or so, I thought I would get my degree, I would get married, and I would be this middle-class person with children. Then I read Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, and literally a light bulb went on my head, and I thought, how is it that I don't even have a father? My mother just works all the time to support us. Why do I think some guy is going to take care of me? And it really was a light bulb moment. I think it's part of the reason that I did not think about getting married or having children for a long time, especially the getting married part. That was not high on my list of priorities.
No, and you were with Allison on and off, but for a long time, and he eventually did ask you to marry him, and you decided to say no.
Yes.
Why?
Allison, throughout our time together, I realized that every once in a while he would show me that he really was the superior one. So he would compete with me in subtle and not so subtle ways. And he also had some health issues that was hard. But I just decided that this is probably not a good thing for me to marry him after 18 years being together off and on. Now, both of us were raised by mothers, so he didn't have a father. And his father died very tragically, and that had a lasting impression on him. But be that as it may, I decided I was not going to be the sort of the helpmate to him, that I would have to make my own way. And the way to do that was not to marry him. And so I said no.
So you started to get involved in politics at the completely grassroots level. I think it was in college, right?
Yes. Yes. So I did various things to broaden my horizons. And at one point I worked in a rural community called Waimanalo to work with 9 other University of Hawaii students to create a teen program for mainly the Native Hawaiian young people who were there. And Waimanalo was deemed a economically depressed area. So off we went. And all the other 8 University of Hawaii students who were picked to be these counselors, they all had protested the war. They had all gotten themselves arrested at Bachman Hall, which was the main administration hall, except for me. So there I was, and I became friends with a person named Steve Carter, whose roommate was one of the leaders, local leaders of the anti-war movement on the University of Hawaii campus. I got to know him, and I began to question the Vietnam War. And we would be talking about, you know, the war and what was going on and the Tet Offensive, all of that. And I decided, I'm going to protest the war. This is not the war that we should be fighting. And so that was my political awakening. Up to that point, I thought I'd become a therapist, a counselor, or give back in that way. But that was my political awakening, protesting the Vietnam War. And I still remember my first protest march and singing "We Shall Overcome." That is still a hugely meaningful anthem to me. We shall overcome.
You know, I think people imagine, especially younger people who weren't there, and you and I were, you were in these demonstrations, I was actually covering them, that everybody was, they imagined that everybody was more or less the same. But in fact, you were the quote, good girl. At the same time, you were very fierce.
Yes, I was always very determined, but my vocalization of a lot of things did not really come up until much later, because in the state legislature, every once in a while, what I would call the terse confrontational side of me would come out, because, you know, I did have the nickname that the guys called me behind my back, the Ice Queen. So anyway, yes, in the culture that I was brought up in, confrontation, vocalizing was not particularly rewarded. And so I figured out other ways to get to my goals.
Well, you were not about to flirt or play girly.
No.
The numbers of women were so tiny. That's why you became known as the Ice Queen. You didn't want to do that.
Yes, every once in a while, back in the day, you know, sadly, women have had to go through this kind of harassment and propositions since time immemorial. So I had my share, but I would just look at them, and if looks could kill, they would have dropped it. So it was like that. And I just went about my work. Yes.
You know, there's a chapter in your book. I'm hopping back and forth because it seems appropriate. But there's a chapter in your book, it's quite short, but it's very powerful, about your brother, Wayne, who got left behind, and who, because he, you know, to bring him in steerage, to have him where your mother couldn't take care of him was just not feasible. It was a Sophie's choice for her, but it was not feasible. And she left him behind with her mother, who was your beloved grandmother. And she eventually was able to bring everybody, your grandmother and grandfather and Wayne, 3 years later, I think, to the States. But this was really hard on him. And you describe that in the book and then later, but describe how hard it was on him, that he may have been teeny, but he knew he'd been left behind.
Oh, yes, we didn't realize the trauma that this separation would have on Wayne at the time. And yes, we came to understand it because he just had difficulties all through school. That separation anxiety, which I understand now, and the trauma was so painful. And to know that he would look at the picture of his family, me and my older brother, my mother, and he would ask my grandmother every night, when are we coming home? Just kind of tears your heart out.
So there's this chapter in the book where your mother used to take him fishing all the time and would drop him off to go fishing. And I guess you can describe the rest better than me. My
brother always had major struggles with school. Schools were not set up to take care of people like him. I would say that he would be diagnosed as having learning disabilities. There would be additional help for him, but back then, no. And so the way the schools dealt with him was to just advance him. And then finally in 10th grade, he got kicked out of school. He finally found a job working at intermittently at a auto repair shop. But when there wasn't enough work, he would go to a place called Lanai Lookout and fish. That was his love. That was the thing that he loved to do, and he was good at it. He would fish from the cliffs. This place called Lanai Lookout is very familiar to people who live on Oahu. And so I rarely talk about my family, Nina. There are people who, for the longest time, didn't even know I was an immigrant. But I hardly talked about my brother. But one day when I was visiting Allison in New York, he was at NYU Law School, and I had another good friend who from Georgetown there. And I was talking about Wayne. It was the first time I had ever talked about Wayne and how much he loved fishing. And my friend, who remains a good friend, Mark Borenstein, who's a judge now in California, he said, "Isn't it dangerous for him to be fishing off the cliffs like that?" And I said, "No, my brother does it all the time. He loves that." And that was the day we lost him. So the wave took him and we lost him.
So there's this moment when your mother is out in the yard and working
Yes.
in a shed. And describe what happened and what
That
happened.
day.
Yeah.
That was the day. So in Honolulu, she was working out in the yard. She loved gardening. So she was outside in the yard watering and doing things. And she had a tool shed that she had built herself. And suddenly there was this loud bang on the tool shed. And she thought somebody had thrown a rock or something. She walked all around the tool shed and there was nothing there. And so she went back into the house after she finished, but she just had a vague sense of unease. And by this time there were ambulance sirens going. Our house then was in the back of a Kalani'ōneiʻi highway, which is one of the big highways, and it was on the way to Lanai Lookout. And she heard all of that, and it wasn't until she got to work, although she did drive to Lanai Lookout to see if Wayne needed a lift before she went to work at 4 p.m. She had a lobster shift, but she didn't see him, so she just went to work. And it wasn't until she got to work that she found out that Wayne had drowned. But that was Wayne telling her goodbye. So these kinds of moments have occurred in my life. The day I talked about Wayne was the day we lost him.
Oh my goodness. So, but it also was part of the reason you were so incensed by the Trump administration's separation policy.
Yes, knowing how traumatic it is for children to be separated from their parents. Well, we saw these children just crying and all of that. But in my own life, my lived experience in my own family and the trauma of Wayne being separated from his mommy was tremendous. He never got over it. And so this is what Trump was doing. It was mindless cruelty, and he didn't care. They didn't even care, and they didn't even keep records of who the parents were. So when a judge in California told them, "You will restore these children to their parents," they didn't have the whereabouts of their parents. How cruel can it get? And I remember a 5th grader from Hawaii who came to visit with me with his parents, and we were sitting talking story, as we say. And I just asked the child, how would you feel if if you were taken away from your parents? And he's this little 5th grader, and he just looked at me and said, "I would want to die." His parents were shocked. I was shocked. That is how this kind of separation trauma. And so we know that there are psychiatrists and therapists who say that this is an ongoing trauma, and that, as far as I'm concerned, our country has a responsibility to do more than restore them to their parents. We have, I would say, additional responsibility. We will have to figure out what that would be. But thankfully, we now have an administration that wants a humane immigration policy, hard as that is going to be to achieve.
you know, you are, I think, only to the other time I remember watching you was, and I didn't understand how difficult it was for you. And if you wonder, that's somebody going somewhere outside my window and I can't shut up the helicopter, the window's open and the helicopter just makes a sound. So you spoke on the floor of the Senate the day, I think it was the day of the vote on Obamacare
Yes.
and revoking Obamacare. It was
Yes.
also the day of the speech of Senator McCain, a very famous and wonderful speech that Senator Kane gave about the duty to do things the right way.
Hmm.
He got a lot of coverage. You got none. But I remember hearing, I went back and to refresh my recollection, as they say, and I pulled a piece of tape from it when I was doing that little profile of you, and I could hear you pounding the table, but you were not just like any other senator on that particular day, and not even like any other senator who cared passionately about that issue. So describe it.
I had been diagnosed with stage 4 kidney cancer. And so the first surgery I had was removal of my kidney. And shortly thereafter, I was on the floor, and that's when I gave my remarks. And it's the first time that I spoke without prepared remarks, because most senators don't do that. I certainly don't do that. But that night, I thought I had a few more things to say. I had already spoken at rallies. I'd given so many speeches about the need to retain the Affordable Care Act. But I thought that night I had something more to say, but I didn't use a podium. I didn't have prepared remarks. That is why I could pound on the table, because I didn't have a podium. But it's the first time that I spoke about my baby sister, Yuriko, who had passed away in Japan. And so I said that this is how important healthcare is, that in my own family, I think if my younger sister had had access, she died at home of pneumonia. I said, if we had had access, maybe she could have lived. And that's what we're doing when we take away healthcare from 20 million people all in one fell swoop. So I said, where? And then I also talked about, a lot of my colleagues, my Republican colleagues, sent me notes and letters saying that they wish me well. And they shared their own health issues. And so they showed me a lot of compassion. And I didn't see that night. And that is why I pounded the table. I said, where's that compassion? Where's that care that you showed me? I know it's there, you see, how hard it must be for them, I tell you, to vote in a way that they have to know is not right. And yet they do it. And yet they go down that path.
You had just gotten out of the hospital, and you had, I think they had to crack your ribs or take out.
And one of my ribs is out. I have a 9-inch plate in there, a titanium plate to hold my ribs together. It's very painful. I found out rib surgery is really, really, really painful. Cutting out a kidney was like nothing compared. I mean, it was compared to my rib surgery, it was like nothing.
We can't repeat what she said to the nurse when she woke up and realized how much pain she was in.
Oh my gosh, I had been forewarned, but it was more pain than I had ever endured. So they had to give me more painkillers.
There are a lot of moments in your book where you're very angry. You try not to. There's only one place where you say you were shaking with rage. And I think that was your first political betrayal.
Yes.
A total political betrayal. And, but beneath that really quite calm exterior that most people see most of the time, you have really, the heart of fire is in you too. And it is in you.
I think I got some of that from my mother. Yes.
Yes. And you learn to sort of walk two paths, the public face to some extent and the private face. But in the last few years, you've abandoned that relatively calm public face. What finally tipped the balance? Was it Trump? Was it you? What was it? What was it?
I was always a very determined person. So in all my political life, I think everyone knew what a determined person, and some people used to call me a hard ass, but it wasn't very obvious. Trump certainly brought that to the fore, because vocalizing my opposition to him became very important, and I decided that I was going to do that. It was not comfortable for me to talk to the national press. It's not part of the comfort zone of an Asian woman from Hawaii, where being vocal and confrontational and all that aggressive is not particularly rewarded. But he was a bully. And there are other, basically, I hate bullies, and I will stand up to them when given the chance. And this was the biggest bully of them all. And so there was a moment when I decided to speak to what's known as a spray of all these reporters. They kind of positioned themselves at the end of the hallway as I'm going through the Judiciary Committee hearing. And there they all were. I was on my way to a hearing. And there they all were. And that was the day that I was really upset with what Trump has said about my friend, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, where he had described her coming to see him. And the innuendo was so atrocious, obnoxious. And I was just ranting about it to my staff. And so as I was walking to the hearing, Will, who is my communication director, said, well, you know what, this would be a good time for you to say something if you feel like it. And so I said, okay, sure. So I get up and I just said, he's a misogynist, he's a liar. I think I am the first senator to have called him a liar. This is in 2017. And that he's an admitted sexual predator, and that he should resign. And then I walked off. I think the press was kind of shocked too, because nobody ran after me with questions. It was like, huh?
Well, it was it was a bit of a double take, because you didn't expect that from you. So everybody sort of went, what just happened?
Yeah. Yes. I think there was that. And then I came to understand that it was really important when you have a president like Trump, where he and his administration are assaulting the body politic every single day with some new atrocity, as far as I'm concerned, that there be people who speak up, and what I would call speak very plainly. I never learned what I would call Senate speak, and I'm really fond of all my colleagues who can do all that, but I never did that. So when I finally did start speaking, it was very plain. I would just say, this is bullshit. I would say he's a liar. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I called on Bill Barr to resign to his face. And so people would come up to me. I didn't do this for the attention. It was freeing. You asked me what, the external stimulus of this big bully sitting in the White House. Also my cancer diagnosis. I think that came together because I who had never even been hospitalized in my entire life, suddenly I have stage 4 cancer. And so I think it's a combination of the need to speak out and my internal flames that just came out. And it's very freeing, Nina. And I became more a total myself. I'm more completely myself.
It's interesting because when I was younger, in my 40s, I actually did lose my temper a couple of times at people who I believed mistreated me in some way. And I learned to suck it up and not do it, because reporters really should do that. And if you're a professional, you don't want to make enemies of people.
Yeah.
And that's partially true for politicians.
Yes.
But you really, the fire finally came out.
Yes, I think so. It was always there, it's like embers and it's just going. But that's why I say I became more completely myself when I could be very plain in my vocal vocalization of what I saw happening around me.
You've had a very long political career that went from being a state legislator, not for just one district, but 2 districts, and then running for lieutenant governor. And you were an amazing organizer, grassroots organizer. And from what I could tell from the book, frankly, grassroots organizing in Hawaii is incredible, or at least at that time was hugely important and is incredibly personal. I mean, it's not just, you didn't just go up to people's doors. You took notes so that you would know the names of their dogs when you return.
I had shoe boxes full of little 3x5 cards that I would use. I knew the names of the registered voters, but a lot of times they would move, so I have to write it all down. And even things like the color of the coloring of their pets, because sometimes that pet would be gone and there'd be another pet, and it would be horrible. Everybody said, "Where's Buster?" And Buster died or something. So I was very meticulous. So this whole thing of I'm a copious note taker, yes.
You find that you worked for 5 years between college and law school, and you got into Georgetown and went to Georgetown. And when you left to go, you had met this very different man. So you can pick up with how you met him and how that relationship ended. It leads to more.
Well, before I went off to law school, in the period when I had broken up with Allison, because we had an off and on kind of thing, but it went on for 18 years with Allison. But before I went off to law school, I met this very funny lawyer. He was the first lawyer that I met who was my age, by the way. His name is Leighton Shima. We were together and we had a really high old time. And I had this notion, Nina, that I would actually, if I ever got married, I would get married to somebody really serious and all that. I had these notions. We all have these notions. I had to get rid of them. But I go off to law school and he was supposed to wait for me in Leighton, and he didn't wait for me. So one night, I remember Christmas time, first year of law school, and I just asked him, "Are you seeing this person? I'm hearing that you're doing that." And he said, "Yes." And I said, "That's the end of our relationship." I hung up the phone, and we really didn't talk to each other for another probably like 13 years. I burned all the pictures that I had of him and all that, and I went on my way. And Leighton got married and with a daughter, and he had his life. He had a very successful law practice. But as chance would have it, I suppose, after Leighton got divorced, he decided he should resume a friendship with me. And so we got back together, and
that was 13 years later.
13
right?
years, yes. And he basically had broken my heart. That's why my mother, who knew of him, and I said, "Mom, I'm going to have dinner with Leighton." The first words out of her mouth was, "That guy? What do you want to have anything to do with that guy?" But fast forward, 8 months later, we were married. My mother and my grandmother both came to live with us when I became lieutenant governor. And my mother and Leighton in particular, they just had such a lovely, lovely relationship. And my mother, Nina, sadly passed away a month ago. And so we have many, many memories of Mom living with us. I'm really grateful for that. And my grandmother, who lived with us until just before she passed also.
You said in the book that he was incredibly considerate of you as a husband. And you told a Sunday story, which I thought was hilarious.
Yes, when we were first married, and he would often watch TV of the sports. He's like a total sports nut. And he was watching one of his beloved football games with the sound turned down. And I walked by, I said, "Why don't you put the sound on?" And he says, "Oh, I don't want to disturb you." And I said, "You're not disturbing me." I thought that was just really very, very considerate. But on the other hand, his goal in life, he has said, is to make me happy. So, hold that thought.
Hold that thought. And
he's lived up to that.
And when you lost you ran for governor ultimately, and you lost, and it was a really tough blow.
Yes.
And he had a sort of a plan and you were out of politics for a short time. but he had a plan to get you back in, but to make you happy in the interim. And it was a wonderful plan. So I'll let you describe it.
The governor's race is still the hardest race I ever ran, emotionally, psychically, and every other way. It was really the hardest race. And so when I lost it, the thing that enabled me to deal with it was the fact that I had done everything I could. I felt that I had done everything I could to win that race, and I just couldn't, I did not win. And I said at that point to my mother and to Leighton that I think I have one big race left in me. I just don't know if I'll ever have the opportunity, but I have one big race left in me. So that's when Leighton started to put aside some money for that one big race, should it turn up. And then he said, I said, you're not expecting me to suddenly cook and do all this stuff. He said, no, you should just relax. You've been doing politics for over 20 years, and I just want you to restore yourself. So I did. For 3 years, I would travel with him, and for the first time, I would be the non-working spouse. It was great. You know, he would be on his depot trips and all that, and I. Very importantly, that he gave me that space because he's that kind of a person. And I also returned to my love of art during that period. And I began to do ceramics with one of my best friends who lives in California. Her name is Norma Yescas. And so I continued to do art with her. I used to spend at least a week or so every year with her. But that is a really important part, Nina, of what keeps me going is the creative expression. And right now, I can't do ceramics in my little apartment in DC, but I make cards, which is very much also in line with the cards that my mother used to make out of pressed flowers. And I make my own paper, and I do my cards look very different from my mother's, but it is the same kind of idea. And so it is a creative expression. A lot of people who got my mother's cards, they keep her cards. And the people who get my cards, you know, it's a part of me that I'm sending to people to thank them.
So I am going to ask you there's a lot more we could talk about, but we have a time limit. So I'm going to ask a few questions that were submitted. And if you think I look strange while I look at these questions, it's because I'm leaning forward to be able to read. One of these questions is about, somebody asks, what do you think about smaller immigration fixes like Amy Klobuchar's Conrad 30 for physicians bill? Are you supportive of the legislation, and will Congress take up bills like this on their own, or is the only hope to be included in broader immigration reform? And I should say, for anybody who didn't see Sunday morning this morning, George Bush has a new book out of paintings, his paintings of immigrants. And he used, because he wanted people to know how important they are to the country and to the development of the country and the kind of country we are. So I'm going to give you a chance to answer this question about the physicians bill, or does there have to be a broader immigration bill?
I think we need comprehensive immigration reform. When I first got elected to the Senate, Republicans and Democrats both said we have a broken immigration system. And at that time in 2013, we worked on a bipartisan comprehensive immigration bill. That's what we need to do. We certainly have to protect the DACA participants, 800,000 of them still facing potential deportation. We needed to have passed that bill when Trump said he'd give me a bipartisan bill and then I'll sign it, which he reneged on, not surprising. So there are the visa issues that need to be addressed. There's a huge visa backlog, particularly in Asian countries where people wait for decades to come to our country. There are the work visas that need to be reformed. So I would like to see comprehensive immigration reform. And now that we have the House, the Senate, and the presidency, I would think that we would come up with an immigration bill that is humane and that will address so many of the immigration issues that we have. Now, at the same time, I have no objections to some of these smaller bills, but what my concern would be that as we start doing these smaller bills, that we're going to forget about the fact that there are 11 million undocumented people in our country who should have a path to citizenship. Why? Because they are working in our country. Many of them pay taxes into the Social Security system to the billions. They will get zero for that. They are living in the shadows. There should be a path to citizenship. And I don't want to forget all of those people who make up our America.
Do you have any advice, asks one person, for young women leaders in our country, especially those hoping to enter politics?
The advice is to get going. There's nothing like, well, my path was to work on other people's campaigns, to get involved in the grassroots, to sign people up for voting, whatever it is you're going to do. Find candidates that you can work for at the grassroots level. That's where you can get a real taste of what you can do, because I think a lot of local races throughout our country can still be won through grassroots organizing. Look at Georgia. That was writ large. You have Stacey Abrams and others who registered hundreds of thousands of voters. Grassroots got them to the polls. You can do it. So the thing is to do it.
Let's see. What's it like to represent a state that's so far removed geographically and culturally from the rest of the US, and where popular perception of the state is so different from many people's experience living there?
I think the popular perception of Hawaii is that it's a very lovely place, which it is, and that it's very culturally diverse, which it is. I'm grateful to represent a state like Hawaii, where we have ideas like aloha, which is that we welcome everyone, ohana, which means we care for more than just our own families and we take care of each other. Those are the kinds of people and the kind of aspirational behaviors that I'm glad survive and thrive in our state. And so I'm grateful to represent the Aloha state, the state of Hawaii. And I wish that there were more places like Hawaii where we are appreciative of other cultures. We are not threatened by diversity. And that's what I'd like to see happen, because we are still in a very divisive time in our country. And of course, the hate crimes against Asians, AAPIs, Asian American Pacific Islanders, on the rise, the systemic racism against the Black community. These are all issues that our country needs to face up to and do something about. In Hawaii, it's not perfect, but there's a lot of intermarriage. We eat everybody else's food. There's a thing called the mixed plate. That's a plate lunch that all of us are familiar with eating. And mixed plate because usually there's a kalbi, Korean, there's rice, there's, Hawaiian laulau, and Filipino adobo. All of these things are all put together in one plate, and that is what we thrive on. That is called a mixed plate. That is Hawaii. I wish more places could be like that.
So Mazie, why did you write this book? It's, as I said, it's beautifully written. It's almost like a novel in places. So
Leighton had been encouraging me to write a book for a long time, but this was a time for me to do it because my mother had suffered 2 strokes. She was not able to articulate. She was not, I just thought this is a time for me to write her story. And I'm really grateful that I did, because the day that my early hardcover version of the book came to my home in Hawaii and I was going to read from it to her is the day she passed. And so I got a special, I requested that my book be cremated with my mother. And I said, as she lay there, that I said, Mom, I wrote a book for you and you're going to take it with you. So it's a comfort to me to know that my mother's book is with her.
well, Mazie Hirono, thank you so much. I know that as we have been talking, there's a link going across the screen. And because I'm an NPR person, I know how to pitch. If you would like to buy the book, please buy the book. It's really easy. You just click on and you make your order. Mazie raises money for politicians. I raise I raise book subscriptions for anybody who writes a good book, and this is a good book. Whether you
Thank-
agree with Mazie Hirono or not, it's a good book.
Mahalo. Thank you. Aloha.
Aloha.
Well, great moderating, Nina, and you're welcome to come to the bookstore anytime and promote all our books. And Senator.
I must say, having it on Zoom is a lot easier. I don't have to ruin my Sunday.
Senator,
Say hi
what,
to your lovely husband, Nina.
My
I got that
my
article.
lovely husband just had a full knee replacement, so I'm cooking, which is, I forgot how much I hate. I'm a perfectly decent cook, but I forgot how much I hate cooking.
Oh, I know, he's the cook.
He's the cook, right?
Yes.
what a remarkable life, Senator, that you had, and it's a truly epic journey, as I think Oprah called it. And
Very
her-
unlikely journey.
Yeah, and it's so well narrated in your captivating book. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. And from all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.